Okay.
Welcome, everyone. We're very many for our last book launch of this year. A special book, The Pensive Image, written by Hanneke Grootenboer. And I only want to quote to show how special it is. T.G. Clarke, who writes about the book, is there a kind of thinking that painting or photography can do, which thinking in words cannot? What with an image? Are there pictures that are especially good to think with? These are the questions of Grootenboer's unflinching, generous book, and her conclusion is pungent. Philosophy needs art to say what it cannot say. I was also involved a bit early stage by having a contribution in a special issue I edited. So I followed the whole process with great enthusiasm, the same kind of enthusiasm that T.G. Clarke expresses here. So I'm really looking forward to this presentation. But let me first introduce Hanneke before I give her the floor. She's professor in the history of art and chair of the Department of History of Art at Radboud University, Nijmegen. Her research focuses on early modern visual and material culture in a transhistorical perspective. She is the author of The Rhetoric of Perspective, Realism and Illusionism in 17th Century Dutch Still Life, Chicago University Press, 2005. Treasuring the Gaze, Intimate Vision in Late 18th Century Eye Miniatures, Chicago University Press 2014, and winner of the 2014 Kensher Prize for 18th Century Studies, and now The Pensive Image, Art as a Form of Thinking. She is co-author with Marisa Bass, who's here present too, Anne Golgar and Claudia Swan of Concophilia, Shells, Art and Curiosity in Early Modern Europe. And we just heard it was out. It's published by Princeton University Press just now. Her current book project deals with spaces of intimacy as locations of the self. Grootenboer will be the Erasmus Lecturer on History and Civilization of the Netherlands and Flanders at Harvard University in the fall of 2021. Hanneke, thank you so much for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Stijn, for this invitation. It has been a wonderful series throughout, and it is a real privilege to be part of it. And many thanks, of course, to Marisa, who has been so very kindly to agree to act as the reference for today. And her work has always been a major inspiration to me. So it is really great to be in conversation with her today. Stijn, I can just click on the image and then...
Wait, sorry. I have to do that for you. So here we are. There we go.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, what we would like to do for today is I will briefly introduce the main themes and ideas of the Pensive Image, and then I will hand over to Marisa, who will have some questions for me. And meanwhile, you are all very much invited to put questions or remarks in the chats that at the end of this Stijn will then read, and I will try to address to the best of my knowledge. And I'm really looking forward to your responses, obviously. This book on the Pensive Image actually grew out of frustration with a series of images that seem to escape traditional approaches or modes of interpretation. Walking through museums or leafing through books, such images would suddenly stop me in my tracks. The kind of images that I refer to are not directly confrontational. They are not in any way impressive or significant or awe-inspiring or surprising, but they are rather the opposite, quiet, modest, and shy almost. To give you an example, this is a work by Jacob Vrel, and it shows us a drab interior with a woman sitting by a fireplace. In contrast to the warm, colored, and richly furnished rooms filled with chatter and with women involved in housekeeping tasks that we know from Pieter de Hoog and Jan Steen and others, this image is empty, colorless, and even a bit chilly despite the prominent presence of the fireplace. The mute palette and small size of the canvas, it's really quite small, underscore the simplicity of the scene. The woman is not involved in any particular task, as we see in other genre paintings, but she seems to be taking a break from it. Her posture reveals the wear and tear of a lifelong routine of hard labor. Having turned her back on us, she prefers not to be seen. Is she stealing a moment that only the painting has given to her? Why did Frel go to the trouble depicting this non-event, or rather this moment in between an action or a gesture? Why should we look at this in the first place? What is there to see here? Another example, Cornelis Bishop's unusual blend of still life and genre painting. We see a corner of a room or a hallway with a door ajar. Such spaces are usually overlooked as a subject for a painting and were probably scarcely noticed even by a 17th century person passing through it. Like Frel's image, this small and marginal painting demands very little from us. There are no symbols to decipher, no clues given as to what exactly is depicted here. And yet, this small box-like space is open to speculation. Something has left the scene that we would like to retrieve. Looking closely at this image, we become less interested in what lies behind this plastered wall, the room behind it, and more in what is expressed by the objects that are projected against it. In the stillness of this drafty little space, the things the passing figure has left behind command our attention, but we are asked not to decipher, but to muse. The composition of these few objects form a constellation of movement and time, which gives rise to a thought about the temporality of a gesture, the fleetingness of a presence, or how such moments in time have passed without our noticing them. A fur-trimmed satin jacket has been carelessly thrown on a chair by a woman who, via the same motion, must have stepped out of her slippers to dash through the open door. We seem to have arrived too late at the scene to perceive only remnants of a woman's rushed entrance. Is this what a space looks like after we have passed through it? In both images, there are no clues given as to what exactly is depicted here, or why, and yet both seem to be open to speculation. We're not invited to read these images, but we have been left waiting, like Frel's image is waiting for the woman to get up, or Bishop's image, let us wait for the woman to reappear. In both cases, it is not that we get these paintings, but that these paintings get us. They have grabbed our attention, yet without having pushed us in a particular direction. Do we, as viewers, find ourselves pondering the jacket or the shoes, or have these things actually started to work on us? Are we thinking about these images, or have we started to think with them, according to them, in a sense that we have perhaps adapted to their pace? In this book, I want to make a case for a new category of immersive art that I propose to call pensive images. Pensive images do not present us with a narrative or a meaning, but offer us instead a line of thought. The pensive image does not express meaning, but seem to articulate through its form and materiality the inexpressive, the inarticulate. The time it takes for us to find the element that has captured our attention, without finding it often, and the period we keep wondering and pondering about it, those are the moments where pensiveness in the image can be found. While these images appear modest and silent, they have the capacity to arrest and to startle us. But there is more. The images are not as quiet as we may think. If we look long enough at Frel's painting, for instance, I think Stijn can actually
Yes,
put it up again. Yeah, thank you.
Yes. So you're here, and then you want to go to the last one, or
No,
the next one?
this is fine.
This
Yes,
one?
this is perfect. Thank you. If we look long enough at Farrell's painting, we see that the resting woman is not fully at rest. She's bending forwards, her chair balancing on two legs, while Bishop's painting is one of suspense. The open door, the dangling ribbons, the cut-off paintings, these images are filled with speculation. And because of that, I suggest that they invite us not to interpret, but to think. In the field of contemporary art and theory, the case for the philosophical dimension of art has often been a topic of debate in recent decades. In film studies, for instance, the notion of thinking in cinema or thinking in film, in particular around the still or the freeze image, has been a topic of lively debate since the 1960s with Chris Marker's La Jetée, and more recently the stilled films of Fiona Tunn or Tacita Dean as its focus. Another example of those debates is, for instance, by Roland Barthes and Jacques Rancière, who have called photographs pensive images. And they define them as images that speak too much, that somehow touch us, that hurt us even. And in their book, What is Philosophy?, Deleuze and Guattari claim three great areas of thinking: in philosophy, in science, and in art. And art is for them always already a form of thought. Another example of recent debates is, of course, contemporary art practice, with the notion of artistic research in which art has frequently been considered as a form of thinking, and often defined as a way of actually of not knowing, of exploring the unthought. So I want to make the case for visual thinking in early modern art, based on the insights gathered from these debates as a framework or as a lens, or at least a starting point from which to view early modern art. And in addition, this book is a response to something that has always puzzled me, and that is why in the 19th century, aesthetics was annexed by philosophy and never found a real foothold within the history of art. Friedrich Schlegel once said, with tongue in cheek, no doubt, that, I quote, "One of two things is usually lacking in the so-called philosophy of art, either philosophy or art." And even though art history has not fully dealt with art's philosophical dimension, and even though philosophy has not fully dealt with philosophy's reliance on images, only have to name Aristotle, Heidegger, Hegel, Herder, there are enough examples of artists who did see their works as things to think with. There's a long history of philosophizing images. Traditionally, vanitas images have raised ontological issues. Nicolas Poussin brought up the thought of painting a few times in his letters. Denis Diderot in his salons famously entered the landscapes by Joseph Vernet in order to roam around in it, contemplating the significance or the structure of language. And of course, Cézanne famously claimed that painting is a form of thinking. Samuel van Hoogstraten, the 17th century art theorist, even claimed that painting and philosophy are both reflective arts and therefore sister arts. Also, emblem books and its more sophisticated sibling, the hieroglyph, were seen as denkbeelden, or thought images, and were the main inspiration for Walter Benjamin's denkbeelder. Within the discipline of art history, this book has many precursors. Mieke Bals quoting Caravaggio, Contemporary Art, Preposterous History, Hubert Damisch's The Origin of Perspective, Svetlana Alpers and Michael Baxendale's Tiepolo and the Pictorial Intelligence, and even Panofsky with his insistence on a philosophical history of art. That is really what he wanted to establish. Exploring, therefore, the philosophical dimension of painting is nothing new, but its history needs to be properly traced, and that is what I have tried to do in this book. So the aim of this book is threefold. I want to define the pensive image and tracing its history. And this book has therefore a distinct transhistorical perspective that seeks connections between contemporary and early modern art. I also want in this book to present an alternative method of doing art history, one that is based on what images do to us rather than what they show or what they are about. And in recent years, recent decades even, anthropology has increasingly defined objects in their intense relationship to humans. And that has partly resulted in the notion of art as having agency. I actually prefer to take Roger Le Pile's view as a point of departure, who wrote at the beginning of the 18th century that we should be more open to an artwork's touch and that we should listen more carefully to what it has to say. And I suggest that if we listen more carefully to what an artwork or a painting has to say, if we let the work take the lead, it will pull us, I think, away from interpretation and towards a state of suspension where thinking can take place. This book also suggests that artworks are not just capable of reflection, but also that some philosophical ideas are better expressed in images than words can ever do. And philosophers like Heidegger, Descartes, Herder, Hegel, and Merleau-Ponty have basically claimed as much. But art history has not made full use of this great potential, I think. And there is, I think, a lot of work still left to do there. Each chapter is based on early modern and a modern or contemporary work of art. And by way of a conclusion, I will give you just one example. One of the issues I try to raise in these works is the relation between space and thinking, and the space needed for thinking, and whether painting is capable of offering such a space. And one of the metaphors of thinking that is used by Descartes and by Heidegger, among others, is that thinking is a pathway towards further inquiry, a going through, and that this pathway should lead the subject, the thinking subject, to its home. And I think ultimately my question is, can art provide a philosophical home for the thinking subjects? All art. My case is for early modern art, but the question is posed much wider. And if it can, it could be on the basis of Plato's notion that the only beginning of philosophy lies in wonder, and not as a form of amazement about something extraordinary, but in an astonishment about something most ordinary in our ordinary lives. And I think it is this I suggest in my book, what pensive images actually can offer to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It's great to see all those pictures connected to the theory you are developing, and then of course getting related to early modern as well as contemporary or modern art theoreticians as well as philosophers. So thank you very much for that. Before giving the floor to Marisa Bass, and I'm gonna put her in the center of our attention. There she is. I would like to present her. She's professor in the History of Art department at Yale University and the 2021 inaugural Guggenheim Fellow in Early Modern Studies. Her research focuses on how individuals use art to find grounding amidst chaos. Her current book project, The Monuments and Public Art and the Modern Republic, asks whether the making of monuments is ever compatible with the making of a modern republic. In it, Bass explores the tension between individual commemoration and the collective aspiration toward liberty in monumental experiments from the Dutch Republic to the present. She's the author of 2 prior monographs, both with Princeton University Press. Jan Gossaert and the Invention of Netherlandish Antiquity, and Insect Artifice, Nature and Art in the Dutch Revolt, winner of the 2020 Bainton Prize for the 16th Century Society for the best book in art and music history. Thank you very much for being here, Marisa. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Stein, for that lovely introduction, and also for, it's such an honor to be able to participate twice in your amazing series this year. So I feel very lucky. Can you hear me okay? Is the sound all right? Yes, good. Hanneke and I are actually going to have a conversation by way of prompting others to join after, because we don't want to talk too long. So maybe you could put us both up on the screen. Is that possible? Perfect, yes. Great. Well, first of all, I really want to thank Hanneke for inviting me to have this conversation with her today on her beautiful book, which I have right here. I actually wore a dress that would color complement her beautiful cover. I first read this book in manuscript form because I was also honored to be able to blurb it on the back. And so when I got it, the physical book, I just thought, wow, this book just in its design so beautifully fits the content, which is really something special and does not always happen. So it's really a book that I have enjoyed thinking with more than once already. So I want to start by asking Hanneke a question that follows up on some of the sort of ideas that she raised in her presentation, and specifically about sort of narrowing in on what the pensive image is, because I think for those who haven't read the book, that's sort of fascinating. What is the pensive image, and sort of how do you work with this idea? One of the things that Hanneke does in her book, I think really beautifully, is consistently talk about pensive images, not by what they are, so not by a clear definition, this is a pensive image, but what they do. So what they do to us as viewers, they are images that we think into, she says, a place where we are invited to dwell, a stumbling block that invites us to stumble into them. And I think central to all of this seems to be an idea that pensive images are images that create a kind of space for thought. And I was thinking about the relationship between this and Hanneke's previous work. So she's thought a lot about space and, from the perspective of perspective, from the perspective of miniatures. And so I thought it would be great if, Hanneke, you could tell us a little bit more about what makes what the pensive image does with space, or does to us, different than the other kinds of images that you've dealt with in your work.
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. Yeah, space has been a continuous theme in this in my work, but it's within the pensive image. It's taking a whole different direction. So yeah, I think in my book on perspective, I dealt mostly with still life paintings, and I was interested in the way in which space relates to meaning, and how a depth of space generates a kind of a depth of meaning, and meaning that could then lay behind things within the depth of the pictorial plane. And I was also interested in the space between the objects in a still life painting, and how, in what way that space became meaningful. And my main frame of reference there was Merleau-Ponty's The Primacy of Perception, and his idea that depth should not be seen as is seen as the third dimension, but should actually be seen as the first dimension, because it is depth that gives us visibility and let us see the things around us. And I compared that to trompe-l'œil paintings that are usually flat, and they actually come forward in order to show how space becomes meaningful in painting, also as a kind of an instrument between truth and falsehood, or between the way in which something can be shown in its truthful appearance, and in the way it can actually be shown in a very deceptive way. And in my book on eye miniatures, space took a whole different notion, and I was talking very much about an intense form of looking that can turn a space into an intimate space. And with with a portrait miniature, that was a book on portrait miniatures and eye miniatures that are often mounted in lockets and often being given as gifts to lovers or family members. And if you have one of those miniatures in a locket and you open it, and you just have this intense looking into that locket, it somehow cancels out the rest of the space, and you are alone with the figure who is actually looking back at you. And with portraits of eyes, the so-called eye miniatures, the only thing that the portrait does, the eye, is actually looking back at you. So the space is completely defined by the exchange of gazes only, and the rest of the world is not there. Representation doesn't count anymore. And this is the notion of intimacy. And that was basically that work was basically inspired by Jean-Luc Nancy's work and on portraiture, and Gaston Bachelard's work on intimate space. And with the Pensive Image, it's different. The focus is on pictorial space as a site of contemplation and reflection, and the kind of the parallels that can be found between pictorial space and somehow mental space and inner space. And the idea, there is a classic parallel between interior painting and interiority, and that has been explored by many people in fascinating ways. And I would like to build on that in this book, also by the idea that the notion of self that is somehow seated deeply into our inner space, our interiority. It's a location that cannot really be physically pointed to. It's not really there. So I think that what we've tried to do is finding other locations for that space in which we can actually reflect and find ourselves. And it's not something that I've come up with. Many philosophers have actually claimed the same thing. So this is a kind of a space in painting that you can enter within a landscape, for instance, or an interior space. But it is also a space in painting that can be defined as a different kind of space that make you reflect about what space actually is. For instance, in the reflection of a dewdrop on a leaf, that you think that it seems as if a whole little universe is opening up in such a tiny little dewdrop. And that makes you, of course, in terms of proportion and skill, it makes you tumble into a different kind of world. That is what the dewdrop does, is of course also what we see in paintings that are better known for the way in which they play with space. Is, for instance, Arnolfini wedding portrait with the mirror, that there is actually an outside space within that space that cannot quite be there. And that also makes us think. It is not, of course, for nothing that we are still talking about the Arnolfini portraits today.
Well, that's wonderful, Hanneke. And I guess I want to follow up by asking you about something you say at the end of probably what is my favorite chapter in the book, the one that's called The Profundity of Still Life. And you end that chapter with a provocative suggestion, I think, that you say, quote, "We may wish to contemplate the possibility of painting as mute philosophy rather than mute poetry," which I think, even though you mentioned Panofsky, but I think there's also a way in which you're disengaging somewhat from a kind of purely humanistic tradition of thinking about early modern painting in relationship to poetry. So it seems that there's an underlying suggestion that you want to make that pensive images and other are different than other early modern images that are linked to text or narrative, such as emblems, which invite reflection and are expressly designed for the reader or viewer to think with, but they don't necessarily ask the viewer to think into them. So could you tell us a little bit more about that distinction? Because I think it also helps us to understand that I don't think you would say that every image is a pensive image. I think you mean a particular kind of image. And so I think the distinction you make between mute philosophy and mute poetry might help us to understand that.
Thank you. That's a great point. And thanks so much for asking. Where to start? This is of course it's a huge question. But I think with the notion of the emblem is, I think, a very good comparison to make, which the emblem, wildly popular in 17th century Netherlands. Everyone was reading them, and everyone knew how to read them, but also knew how to play with them, and how to kind of squeeze new meanings out of them. And it is per definition a genre that needs to be read, or needs to be studied, and needs to be deciphered. And even though they're quite often they obviously have moral messages to contain, but the way people play with them, and the way people also in their private albums sometimes invented their emblems of their own, or made variations on existing emblems and made them into their own in a way. It shows us how people were, how allegorical their thinking was, how emblem oriented their thinking was, and how they could play with them. And in one of these is still a beautiful study, even though it was written so long ago, almost 100 years ago. Mario Pras, a fantastic study on emblems. He actually argues that it is not a closed form in which the viewer or the reader of the emblem is asked to find a particular meaning, but it is actually an open form that people can return to over and over again, and also in conversation with others find new meanings into. I think that the emblems still need to be deciphered, but they have this open form, and you can actually play with them. I think with pensive images, those are images that offer us very little, and certainly no clues, or no real narratives or meaning, no obvious narratives or meanings. They might be in there, but it's not just there for us to pick up on. They offer us so little, and still there is something that draws us in, that grasps our attention, and of course our first hinge is to start to read them, start to interpret them, and there's very little results. And that is why I think that they really start to push us floating, really, that we actually we can't really have much grasp and much holding on to, and it rather seems that these images play with us rather than the other way around. We cannot really play with them the way we're used to play with them. So it's a fundamentally different way of looking, to which they invite us, as long as, of course, we are open to it, and we are susceptible to it. And I think we need to be willing to go along and let this image take the lead. And I think then we might find what we're looking for.
That's lovely. And I think it also gets at another question I was going to ask you that maybe you could just answer really briefly, which is, many art historian readers of your book, particularly early modernists, might think immediately of Victor Stoichita's The Self-Aware Image, which, as we know, has a big footprint on our field still. And that's a book that I think is defining the notion of the kind of playful, self-aware, the self of the image very differently than you. And I think it has to do with authorship, maybe, in a way that your notion of the pensive image does not. Do you just, about sort of artistic authorship, or sort of the demonstration of that in pictures in a way that you're not so interested in? I don't think you're so interested, as I understand it, in the kind of intentionality of the artist in performing their identity through the pensive image, but in the interactive nature of the pensive image. Is that right, or do you want to? You will say it better than I just did. Sure.
But I'm so glad that you bring up Stoichita's book, because of course it is such a beautiful book, and I think it is such an important study, and one of the most important studies, I think, in the field of early modern art. And I actually had the privilege once in the very early stage of this project to talk to him, and he very kindly said that he agreed that not all pensive images were self-aware, but there were definitely self-aware images that were pensive in his view. But of course, a lot of my work is very much inspired by his way. Is the most beautiful example of what we now call a transhistorical perspective, where he takes a very theoretical framework fed by Derridian philosophy and looks back at early modern art, and he does that so successfully. It's just it's amazing. For Stoichita, painting is self-reflexive because it plays with its limitations and it tries to overcome them. But it's very much he traces his history of painting as a history of this play with limitations, and the works that Stoichita discusses as works that then in their playfulness with their own limitations, and they point to their own materiality and their status as images, and most of the works that Stoichita discusses are images that are very loud in a way. They're very present. They're very confrontational. They really want you to get what they're saying. A lot of trompe-l'oeil paintings, a lot of paintings that somehow joke with your perspective, and in order to, with false frames, in order to make you aware of their materiality. So they're tricking the beholder. Often they surprise the beholder. They are manipulative, deceptive. They seem to be making a lot of noise around their presence, and also these images are there to outsmart our perception. They really want to be somehow smarter than us, and we see this another example of that category of images, and kind of building upon, I think, Stoichita, is the a few years ago there was a special issue of art history on clever objects. There were also objects who were somehow trying to outsmart us as beholders. And another example is Alexander Marr's fantastic projects on ingenuity and on witty images, and on knowing images. And the knowing images is also a kind of a confrontational image. The image knows more than you in a way, and you're trying to get it. Now, pensive images, I think, are somehow in this spectrum of images working on their status as an image, but pensive images are on the other side of that spectrum. They are not confrontational. I think they seem to be more of an instrument, as if they're just. It's not that they trick us or that they try to manipulate us or trying to outsmart us, but they somehow try to enable us to think and to allow for a certain space in which thinking can take place. Whereas for Stoichita's typically self-aware images, they really reach out, and I think the term Beeldacht is here really applicable. They really reach out. They want to say something. They want to get their message across, and no matter how, and they will. But pensive images do not. They really take us to a different realm almost, and kind of an in-between moment. They might take us by surprise, but then we don't really know what the surprise is. We have to start filling it in by ourselves. And they have the same logic, I think, as what Roland Barthes says about the the photographs with a studium, that they reach out to you, they prick you, they hurt you, they grasp you, and you're not, you know that what has grasped you is in the picture, but you can't really put your finger on what it is in that picture that really gets to you. And it has nothing to do with any clues or nothing. And even if you look at that painting of that photograph again, Roland Barthes writes, he says it could be actually a different detail this time, that you think, this is actually what gets me. And so you return, pensive images are images that don't get you, but you return to them and you try to understand what, they really pose a big question mark. You really try to understand what it is that they are doing and what they are doing to you. And in that mode, you spend time with that image, and in that mode, you start to add to that image ideas, notions, thoughts, ponderings, musings. And this is also what Barthes, I think, means by this notion of adding. He talks about adding, that you start to adding to the photograph as if there is a little hole in it and we have to fill it. So I think that they really offer, pensive images offer a space or even a hole that can be filled with reflection. And they're not, in that sense, self-aware in this more explicit and loud way.
Well, Bart is a perfect segue to the last question I want to ask you, because I see there are many questions in the chat I want us to get to. But just very briefly, I think something I guess I wanted to signal in relationship to your book is that I think we don't talk as art historians enough about how what we write about, the objects we choose to write about, dictates the way that we write about them. And it seems to me that you had a very conscious way that you designed this book in terms of its style, in terms of it being transhistorical, as you've already said. Could you just tell us, just very briefly, a little bit about your process of thinking about how to write this book, and the way that you designed it to bring out the objects that you are focusing on?
Actually, I think the book somehow formed itself in my search for the pensive image. I realized that so many artists and also theorists and philosophers and contemporary artists had thinking and work had thought and were working with this idea of art as a philosophical object somehow. And but what I really wanted to do was both. It was like both ways. I wanted to trace the pensive image, make a case for them, and also make a methodological case for art history, so that we would be able to find an opening within our fantastic and rich, great discipline for another little strand in addition to everything that we have, and that is then this philosophical art history where we could reflect on art as a form of philosophy or as a form of thinking. So that was one thing. And on the other hand, I really wanted to let the image, the paintings, really, to give them the floor, to let them shine, and to show, in order to show that it was not that me as an art historian, armed with so many approaches and so many methods, that I was going towards those images and apply those methods to them and then get something out of them, which is still, it's a very good way of dealing with works. But I wanted to do it the other way around and really seeing, it was a bit of an experiment, really seeing where images would take me if I would really try to listen to them in Roger Lepille's fashion. So the style of writing had to be somehow open and careful and meandering and kind of around. It had to have this openness of indetermination and of it's not doubt, but it is very much more an kind of an openness in which you have to let things happen, and just and then see where it goes. So I have let things happen. Yeah, and
Well,
we'll see how it goes.
Thank you so much, Hanneke. It was so fun chatting with you.
Thank you, Marisa. Great questions. Thank you so much.
Thanks, both of you. There are many questions in the chat. So let's start with the questions from the audience. First one is by Larry Silver. How is the process of viewing a pensive image, related to a concept of viewer response, akin to reader response theory in literary criticism?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would. It's not that it is based upon that it is based on it, but it is certainly related to it in the sense that its reader response theory also just gives you as a reader a kind of an openness, or you have to actually approach the work, the book as with this kind of an openness. I am a student of Michael and Holly. Her work is I think deeply rooted in reader response theory, but she took it in another direction, and in a direction of phenomenology primarily. And in her last, I think she really showed in her last article in Art History on the Bruegel exhibition, where you could actually, where this combination of reader response theory and phenomenology would lead you. I think I have left reader response theory a bit behind, and I went into another direction. But it's a different approach with a horizon of expectation. I think I've let go of that horizon, or I've tried to let go of that horizon of expectation on the image suggestion, I think.
Yes. Thank you. A question that's already addressed, but then maybe taking this a step further, is by Itai Sapir. Aren't all images potentially pensive images? That's what you already addressed, of course, but then the extra question is interesting. Do some images instead impede or block the viewer's thinking process, or could those be, as it were, a negative trigger to critical thinking?
That's a great, Itai, that's a great question. Yes. Pensive images can be stumbling blocks. They always are stumbling blocks, because they make you think like, what is going on here? They really stop you in your tracks. Walter Benjamin has once said that thinking involves not only the flow of thought, but their arrest as well. And I think this is important. This is an important thing that images do, that they actually create, that pensive images do, that they create a stumbling block, an arrest. They throw up a barricade to us, and we are somehow unable to deal with that barricade at first, with the instruments that we have at hand, with the methods that we have at hand. So we have to somehow let go of these methods in order to deal with it. Can it be a negative effect? Well, it depends what you call negative. In a Heideggerian way, or at least how I understand Heidegger, this is the confrontation with an image, and his famous example is in Van Gogh image, and not with the shoes, but another one. The confrontation with an image can actually make you finally become aware of the nowhereness that we are, this kind of no man's land that life actually is, and the fact that we may think that we have found our place and that may think that we have a home, but we're not even close. We're not even there yet. And I think that realization, of course, for Heidegger produces an angst and produces great anxiety. But that anxiety for Heidegger is exactly the moment that we finally start to think. So that realization is, of course, is deeply disturbing, but it does make us think, and that is where we have to go. And is what he suggests. So negativity, that negative stumbling block can be can within philosophy can have quite an useful effect.
Yes. Two questions by Walter Melian. One about the meditation, image as a meditation. I'm wondering about the paradigm of the pensive image as it relates to the kinds and degrees of meditative image produced in 16th, 17th centuries and the lines of thought they encourage.
Yeah, that is a fantastic question, and that is something that I have been thinking about, and I'm returning to it, and of course, Walter, your work, the meditative image, I have it's right here. Anyway, is fundamental there. I think it's very different, because meditative images is, of course, it's also something that is very much related to a particular time period, where in which people used images in a particular way. The pensive images, I see it is somehow located in the 17th century, but with a kind of a long history from the 17th century onward to today. I think that thinking and meditating is not quite the same, and that it is that I find it now hard to really I'm not going to run the risk saying something that is not quite correct, but I think that the meditation and thinking in a post-Descartes, post-Reformation, humanist area is different, and it, again, of course, you can't. That is also different from a 20th century way of thinking. And I think that's one of the first distinctions that I would lay there.
So that's certainly food for thought. The second question.
Thank you, Walter. That's a great question.
The second question has to do with images that operate in hybrid registers. For example, a landscape, parts of which might be construed as pensive. Other parts of that landscape can be consist of embedded episodes from Ovid or parabolic biblical scenes. So how to deal with that kind of hybridity?
Yeah, that is wonderful. I haven't really been dealing with landscapes in my book, or I haven't been dealing with landscapes yet. I have been dealing with them, but I'm not there yet. I'm still working on it. I think that some landscapes are clearly also traditionally they invite for introspection. They are really pathways of the mind, and that you can follow with different stages. And in that sense, those are very much meditative images, and you find certain stations along the way. And images with landscapes with narrative images, I would say, cannot really quite be pensive, because the narrative will take away from the pensiveness as I understand it.
Another question by Larry Silver is, how does this relate the pensive image to Susanna Berger's philosophical image?
Susanna's beautiful book, The Art of Philosophy, is a great inspiration. What I think is fantastic about Susanna's work is that she makes a distinct point for a secular approach of images, and that so she takes it away from religious meditation and focuses on those fantastic broadsheets, and in a profound Aristotelian way. And that kind of secularism that philosophy brings with it, I think that I was trying to build upon in the Pensive Image. Her notion of visual thinking and how she explores it is definitely at the it's a source of inspiration, but also something that I would like to build upon. It's a fantastic book.
Question by Joanna Mockney. To what extent do, you already mentioned Van Hoogstraten, of course, but to what extent do 16th and 17th century sources influence your theory, especially in relation to how contemporary beholders perceived art?
Yeah, that's a very good question, of course. What was the first part? Sorry, Stijn. What did you?
Actually, it's about the beholder. So, in how far you have, for example, viewer responses of the 16th, 17th century, or theories about viewing art, and how far does that relate to your theory of the pensive image?
Yeah, in this, I think this is more one of my next projects. In this book, I look at art from a contemporary perspective, and I look at also how what's early modern theories and philosophies and theories, what they do with images, how they present images, what their theories are, definitions are about images and what they do. But I have not dealt with contemporary viewing responses directly. What I do explore in the book is the way in which how certain paintings were actually located in certain spaces, and what those spaces in the house would actually provide.
That's exactly the question that Emily Cox is also asking. So I just read it aloud. Maybe you can elaborate a bit more on the answer we were just giving. I wonder if the space-making capacity of the pensive image, which creates a site or home for contemplation, intervenes in current debates in the humanities about the value of discipline-specific versus interdisciplinary inquiry. Might an approach which brings together art and philosophy by dwelling in the state of suspension, where an image pulls us to think, offer a way out of this disciplinary, interdisciplinary binary? It's a complicated question, so do you have it, or do you want me to repeat it?
Emily also has a follow-up question a little bit farther down.
Yeah, I can't.
To put it another way, it seems like close attention to the space in which an object invites us to think shifts the terms of what cross-disciplinary inquiry might be, or whether, indeed, this is even the right term for such an approach.
I can't read the question, but I know how deeply Emily thinks about those things, and I would love to answer it. But maybe we could actually take this over the email, where I can actually where we can explore more what exactly Emily means by interdisciplinarity and disciplinarity, and how the pensive image propels us out of that.
That's good. It's a good idea, because there are still some other questions left. So in that way, I would like to ask a question of Klim Wijnands. Your idea of interior painting as spaces for contemplation is very interesting. Do you think it's significant in this regard that these idealized interior painting originally hung in rooms that may not have been that different from the paintings they contained, where the original beholders perhaps triggered to contemplation by these paintings because they depict spaces that are more or less at the same time very familiar, yet also different?
Yeah, that's also a great question. You have those great interior paintings that are trompe-l'œil paintings, and they take you by surprise, and you want to just jump into it. I think that's I'm not, as I said, I don't know about viewers in the 17th century in that respect. I don't know how, actually we know very little about that anyway. I don't know how they would view an interior and why they actually had so many interior paintings in their interiors that kind of in that mirroring way. That already is an interesting question to raise. What I have done is look at particular paintings, and if you stand in front of them or if you sit in front of them, what do they do to you? And that is, again, I have to stress this. This is again, of course, a contemporary perspective that I lay over these paintings, because the way they were hung and the way people were looking at them is completely different, which is something, again, that I address in my next project.
Yes, great. Do you see any connection between the pensive picture or pensive image and the introvert character?
The introvert character?
Yes, the relation between pensive image and introvert character.
I don't think that I am aware of what an introvert character is. Oh, you mean introvert in general? This is.
I also think that also the images you show were people in introspection. Maybe this is also something.
Yeah, and I think yes, no, that's the fact that we see people on the back, and actually that of course that I think what these figures do clearly is to invite us to somehow mimic their posture and their state of contemplation.
Yes.
So the image in that sense starts to become a mirror. That's a well-known trope. Yes.
Then a question by Panofsky. You said that by Zach Smitline, you said that Panofsky argued for philosophical art history. It would be great if you could explain that a bit more. I ask this because I read a great article by Anne Holly, Back of the Painted Beyond, that deals with image that I would argue are pensive. Yet Holly seems to suggest that these images exceed the bounds of Panofsky's approach.
Yeah, Panofsky, it's too long to explain this why Panofsky actually argues for a philosophical art history. But one of the things is that he really based his method of interpretation on Ernst Cassier's work and the symbolic form. Holly's article is brilliant. I think our projects, how can it not be? But our projects are very very much related. But what she does in the end, by looking for that notion of infinity and really arguing about her own embodied mode of viewing, is, I think, in the end, is very related, and I think we should really be in one room together. We are on the same shelf, but I think we take different directions there.
And then theories about Einfühlung. Do they play along with the theory of the pensive image? Einfühlung, the empathy.
Yeah, no, I'm not sure that I can answer that. I'm not familiar with these theories enough to be able to say something useful.
Another question then, more than questions enough, so in that way. Martha, Sophie, could there be an interactive contemplation between the viewer and the painting, the share, code, or person, unique theoretical interactive space?
Yeah, that's a great question. That there is a kind of a real bouncing off just back and forth. I think there is, because the way in which pensive images work, as I understand it, is that they you revisit them, you just return to them, and you return to them over and over again. So you actually do start different from an image that you interpret and that you work with and you study. You have a different relation with you could have a different relation with a pensive image, because it's a thing to think with rather than a thing to look at or to deal with and study for what it actually is, or what it says.
A question by Ronnie Bar, a subject that's already addressed, but still. Are pensive images the same for everyone? Does one person's whole for reflection necessarily affect the next person in the same way?
That's such a difficult issue always, isn't it? With interpretation, it's the same. Like, is what you say is the same? It is. Of course, it is and it isn't, but there are patterns, and I think that we see in philosophy also that, and in writing on art, that's these patterns are more or less the same. So I think we always think that our experience is ours, but of course we follow cultural patterns as well. So I think it is the same as with interpretation. So yes and no.
And to end, there are two questions by Machtel Löwenstein. One elaborating on the question of Walter Mellion, so about the connection between religion and the religious aspects, the possible religious aspects of the pensive image. When considering the potentially religious aspect of the pensive image, also in comparison, asked to be made with a devotional image of the later Middle Ages. Could you contemplate on this?
I make a distinct departure from religion in my book, and I follow, in that regard, Heidegger, who said, well, religion and philosophy cannot go, it's either the one or the other. So that is, if you deal with religious imagery or with a religious approach to images, that is a whole different field that I have not addressed.
Yes, clear. Very last question by Machteld. Another question is Another question is about the rhetorical in relation to the pensive image, especially in the rhetorica, the concept space within thinking plays an important role. And how far do you address that? And can you build on that? I think Machteld is referring to the loci et imagines idea in the memory part of the handbooks of rhetoric.
Yeah, that is another really fascinating suggestion, of course, that we could follow up on, which is not what I've done in this book, but it is definitely something that is worth looking into. Yes.
That's a very good end for this lovely presentation. Always food for thought, always future projects. That's exactly what we wanted to hear. Thank you very, very much, Hanneke, for presenting your book. Thank you very much, Marisa, for being the referent. Thank you very much, everyone in the audience, for all those very interesting questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's great questions. And thank you so much, Marisa. It was wonderful having a conversation. And thanks, of course, Stijn. It's wonderful series and wonderful sessions. And thank you.
The very last one, this one, but next year we will certainly do more of this, and you're all welcome again. So bye-bye, everyone. Have a great summer.
Bye.